You're probably looking for a top 10 list or a high-energy documentary. You want a clear beginning and a satisfying conclusion. Sorry to disappoint. I'm just a librarian in a room made of sand. I don't have a call to action, and I don't care if you subscribe. I'm just trying to find a book that doesn't want to be found. Close your eyes. Logic is too heavy for tonight anyway. My shoes were heavy, and the sh-sh sound they made with every step was becoming less like walking on sand and more like wading through extremely dry cement mix. The fine, luminous silica that constituted the floor, the walls, and indeed the entire literary output of this sleeping city had successfully colonized the interior of my cheap canvas footwear. I registered this fact without interest. It was simply the ongoing state of things. The city existed solely on the periphery of consciousness, a half-remembered architectural whisper, and the primary consequence of existing in a whisper was that you constantly tracked its particulate matter wherever you went. It didn't matter if I took them off. The moment I paused, my feet would simply begin to accumulate new layers of narrative dust. It was a librarian's burden, I suppose, if you could call a perpetual state of gritty discomfort a burden rather than just a slow, unavoidable sedimentation of the soul. The Beatles, too, were insistent. They were currently performing the third verse of the lullaby of Lost Receipts. It was a monotonous, high-pitched drone, perfectly tuned to the specific frequency of existential resignation. My pockets, 4 of them now, thanks to the addition of 2 hastily sewn patches made from the cover of a misfiled pamphlet on the proper etiquette for talking to puddles, were warm with their collective glow. They were the physical embodiment of the sentences I had tried to read, the literature transformed from inert sand into motivated, humming insects. I had nearly 3,400 words tucked into my left thigh pocket alone, all of them related to the structural integrity of theoretical staircases. They were comfortable. I granted them that, but their music was distracting. It was hard enough trying to balance the concepts without an accompanying choir of miniature, living typographical errors buzzing in G-sharp. I adjusted my hands, distributing the weight of the 2 books I was currently processing. On the left, the collected works of Minor Annoyances, Volume 7, Dust Motes and Misfiled Receipts. On the right, Why Keys Are Always Where You Looked First, a conjecture. The sand, representing Annoyances, was notably cooler to the touch, slightly coarser, suggesting a fresher, less processed form of forgetfulness. The conjecture sand felt ancient, pre-processed by millennia of generalized human confusion. They were both equally liable to slide off my hand and revert to raw silica, a devastating literary loss, but one I had long since learned to accept with weary inevitability. My mission, the thing that theoretically kept me moving through the ever-shifting non-Euclidean geometries of the library, was organization. Specifically, the organization of all written knowledge based on the weight of a forgotten secret. This metric was fundamentally useless, but it was enshrined in the foundational bylaws of the Sleeping City Library Collective. Bylaw 4, subsection B. Measure everything that cannot be measured using tools that are inappropriate for the task. The tool I possessed was a rusty spoon. It lay across the wrist of my left hand, balanced precariously next to Annoyances. It was a terrible spoon. It was the color of dried blood and regret, mottled with deep orange pits where the metal had simply given up the ghost of its structural integrity. It wasn't even standard cutlery size. It was too large for tea, too shallow for soup. It was a spoon designed for scooping lukewarm apathy, and now I was forced to use its concave surface as a precise analytical scale for moral weight. I needed to determine where these two books belonged in the grand, unseen scheme of forgotten secrets. Secrets, naturally, do not have weight. But the memory of a forgotten secret might carry a kind of residual metaphysical burden, a slight, almost imperceptible drag on the temporal fabric. This is what I was meant to be weighing. I scooped a theoretical tablespoon of sand from annoyances. The spoon felt heavy with the nothingness it contained. I held it level, squinting at the surface. Did this forgotten secret, probably the time someone pretended to understand a very complicated poem, possess enough gravitational pull to warrant placement in the third or fourth quadrant? If I placed it in the third quadrant, it suggested a secret heavy enough to cause minor disturbances in local weather patterns, perhaps a slight unexpected drizzle in June. The fourth quadrant implied a secret so trivial it was essentially a vacuum, occupying space without existing. The spoon gave me no answers. It only reflected my own tired, vaguely disgruntled reflection back at me, warped slightly by the rust. This tedious, pointless measurement was what had occupied the majority of my subjective time here. 80 years, or perhaps 3 minutes. It was impossible to tell, as time in the sleeping city tends to pool in corners like spilled milk. The only reliable marker of temporal passage was the rate at which my shoes filled up, and the changing repertoire of the Beatle choir. My current objective was the history of silence, a singular, deeply paradoxical text, a book about the absence of noise, likely composed of an equally silent substance, possibly a fine dust of forgotten breaths. If I could locate it, I could finally categorize a benchmark for absolute zero weight, a true zero secret, and maybe, just maybe, the rest of the library organization would fall into place. Though I doubted it. Order was strictly forbidden here. I attempted to move forward, past an aisle that had just materialized entirely dedicated to the study of lint dynamics. The problem, the persistent, architectural, headache-inducing problem, was the stone cats. They were everywhere. They sat on pillars, on pedestals made of pure concept, and sometimes, inconveniently, directly in the middle of where I wanted to put my foot. They were not alive in the traditional sense. They were heavy, carved things, their eyes polished obsidian discs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They didn't move while. I watched them. They only moved when I failed to watch them, which meant, inevitably, when I blinked. My eyes were dry. The air was dry. Everything here was composed of dry, granular literature, and my biological necessity to lubricate my visual organs was the primary catalyst for geographical chaos. I could feel the inevitable, irritating descent of my eyelids approaching. I tried to hold them open, staring fiercely at the stone cat closest to me. Agnes, a particularly stern-looking tabby carved from basalt. If I could just stare her down, maybe the aisles would stay put for another few seconds. No use. The grit was too much. I had to blink. I took a deep, shuddering breath, holding the rusty spoon perfectly still, ensuring the fine sand literature remained balanced. Blink. It was a fraction of a second, an absence of visual input, but the sound was immense. A low, subterranean grind. Not loud, but heavy, like mountains shifting their posture. The stone cats were dragging their foundations across the theoretical floor plane. I opened my eyes. The change was immediate and irritatingly comprehensive. The aisle dedicated to lint dynamics had vanished entirely. Agnes was gone. In her place, a new cat, Bartholomew, a Siamese with particularly judgmental eyes, now sat atop a pillar that had grown taller by approximately 14 feet. The spiral helix of aisles, which moments ago had been behind me, was now directly to my left, running perpendicular to my path. I was standing in a small clearing dedicated exclusively to theoretical taxonomy, a space that felt slightly colder than the rest of the library. "Honestly, Bartholomew," I muttered, but the sand on the back of my right hand, "why keys are always," trembled slightly. I couldn't risk displacement. I was facing a new aisle, one composed of shelves, actual, solid, mahogany-colored shelves, a rarity here, that stretched into an infinite, foggy distance. The books on these shelves were not sand. They were solid, bound volumes, but they were all completely blank, their titles existing only as deep, impressed silence on the spine. This was promising. This felt like the area where the history of silence might reside, somewhere between the unwritten laws and the biographies of people who never existed. But I couldn't just walk straight toward it. The stone cats, now scattered across the newly formed geography, were waiting for the next blink. And I had to determine the weight of the forgotten secrets first. I shifted the rusty spoon. Time to analyze. Why keys are always where you looked first. I scooped a larger pinch of the ancient sand. This sand was heavier, morally speaking. It was weighted with the vast oceanic regret of misplaced certainty. The kind of forgetting that implies you knew something truly profound and then simply decided to put the knowledge down somewhere obvious, and then walked away forever. I focused intensely on the texture of the sand on the spoon. It felt dense. I hypothesized that this volume, this specific weight of historical forgetting, belonged in the sixth quadrant, reserved for secrets that, when forgotten, created measurable, though minor, gravitational anomalies. The kind of anomaly that causes toast to always land butter side down. I had to be certain. I held the spoon up toward the nearest source of illumination, which was Agnes, who had reappeared 2 aisles over, radiating a dull, internalized glow. The light caught the sand, and as it did, I felt a familiar, sickening internal shift. The moment the light touched the sand on the spoon, 2 grains detached themselves and instantly transformed. Click, click. 2 more beetles, black, hard-shelled, and vibrating with new life. They immediately dropped from the spoon's surface, fluttering the tiny distance to my trousers, and promptly crawled into the pocket nearest the ankle. They added their buzzing voices to the lullaby of lost receipts. The pitch rose slightly, now a mournful G sharp and B flat. This was the penalty for analysis. Every time I focused on the literature, every time I engaged with the sentence or the concept, it metabolized into more noise, more weight in my pockets, more obligation. I had lost 2 grains of why keys are always. 2 tiny fragments of profound conjecture, now condemned to forever hum about their displacement. I had to place the remaining sand quickly. I decided. 6th quadrant it was. The gravity felt right. But where was the 6th quadrant now? Before the blink, it had been a short, straight path past the biographies of damp sponges. Now, the damp sponge section appeared to be orbiting the ceiling, currently inaccessible. I scanned the new landscape. The spiral helix of the 1st and 2nd quadrants was to my left. The infinite, blank-spined aisle of theoretical taxonomy was ahead, and to the right, a long, low stack of sand piles that seemed to undulate slightly, mimicking waves. That, by the faint shimmer emanating from it, was the section dedicated to forgotten names of distant stars. High moral weight, probably 7th or 8th quadrant. My destination, the 6th, had to be somewhere in between the high-weight celestial data and the low-weight, spiraling trivia. I decided to walk toward the blank-spined aisle, assuming the quadrants ran consecutively along the periphery of the major architectural features. I took a step. Shh, shh. The sand in my shoes shifted, applying a slight chilling pressure to my arches. I shifted the sand on my hands again. The tension required to balance literature composed entirely of loose particles was exhausting, demanding a focus that was continuously undermined by the humming chorus in my pockets. As I walked, I started to contemplate the nature of silence itself, preparing myself for the moment I might actually find the book. What does the history of silence look like? Does it chronicle the invention of quiet? The various epochs of non-sound, from the pre-vocalic era to the post-humming drones of the present? The more I thought about it, the more theoretical I became, and the more theoretical I became, the warmer my pockets felt. I could feel the sentences stirring, anticipating the chance to transform. I had to stop thinking about literature as literature, and start thinking about it as granular stability. I was near the beginning of the blank-spined aisle now. The physical books were disturbing. Their stillness was too absolute. They represented secrets that were not merely forgotten, but actively, structurally erased. The kind of heavy, oppressive nothingness that required actual shelving. I paused, realizing the position I was in. I needed to move the 6th quadrant books, but I hadn't found the specific location. I needed to keep my eyes open to locate it. But the sheer architectural intimidation of the blank spines was forcing a blink. The weight of that much deliberate absence was palpable. I could see Agnes, Bartholomew, and 2 other stone cats, Claudius and Penelope, all aligned in a terrifyingly neat formation just beyond the blank aisle. They were waiting. They were always waiting for the lapse, the human moment of vulnerability that allowed them to redraw reality. If I blinked now, the blank aisle would undoubtedly swap places with the section dedicated to whistling bread, sending me miles off course. And I might lose annoyances, Fuller 71, to the inevitable displacement. I decided to risk a measurement without looking. Blind organization. I felt for the location of the 6th quadrant with my foot, scraping the sand until I felt a slight rise in the floor. A subtle ridge where the sand piles were intentionally heaped higher. This was a physical marker, a rare piece of permanence. The 6th quadrant ridge. I placed annoyances, Fuller 7 house, gently on the ridge, releasing the tension in my left hand. The sand settled with a faint whoosh. A small victory. I had successfully categorized a minor annoyance. Now, I was left only with why keys are always where you looked first, a conjecture, on my right hand. It was heavier, reserved for the 6th quadrant's high side, or perhaps the 7th. I couldn't risk placing it blind. I desperately needed to see where the 7th quadrant had ended up. I squinted, resisting the urge to close my eyes. My vision blurred. Claudius, the cat furthest away, seemed to be vibrating slightly. I failed. The necessity of basic ocular hygiene overcame the organizational imperative. Blink. The familiar grurrend was sharper this time, punctuated by a sound like dry ceramic cracking. When I opened my eyes, the air smelled faintly of petrified moss. The blank-spined aisle was gone. The seventh quadrant, the section containing the forgotten names of stars, had not only moved, but it had inverted. It was now a ceiling, a low canopy of undulating sand piles suspended impossibly above me, the surface tension of forgotten knowledge keeping it from collapsing. And where the aisle had been, the history of silence. It lay on the floor, not as a pile of sand, but as a single, perfectly smooth, black obsidian slate, entirely devoid of texture or inscription. It was absolute zero literature. It weighed nothing, not even the burden of a single grain of dust. I reached out, but hesitated. I had found my objective, the anchor point for all organization. But I was not prepared to touch it. To pick it up would be to assume the absence of weight, and that was a philosophical commitment I was too tired to make. And then I noticed, just inches from the slate, Bartholomew, the judgmental Siamese cat, was lying on his side, his obsidian eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He hadn't just moved. He was stuck. The last blink had immobilized him. This was my chance. I could proceed, now that one of the agents of chaos was incapacitated. But first, I had to place why keys are always somewhere. Since the seventh quadrant was now the ceiling, I decided the floor beneath it would be a symbolic placement for heavy conjecture. I lowered my hand and poured the remaining sand gently onto the ground near the obsidian slate. It settled immediately, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding library floor, and then, as the last grain left my hand, I heard a chorus of clicks and a rush of buzzing sound. Every single grain of why keys are always where you looked first, a conjecture, had transformed into a tiny, motivated insect. The floor was instantly covered in a shimmering black carpet of beetles. They were all humming the lullaby of lost receipts, but now amplified a deafening, vibrating roar of tiny, living typographical errors. They crawled instantly toward my trousers, swarming up my legs. My pockets were full to bursting. I was drowning in the physical realization of consumed literature. The pressure was intense. The stone cat, Bartholomew, let out a slow, grinding sigh, the sound of geological disappointment. The sudden, overwhelming noise had clearly upset his petrified sensibilities. I looked down at the obsidian slate, the history of silence. It remained inert, a black hole of non-textual information, completely silent amidst the cacophony. I had found the book, but I had accidentally manifested an entire historical epoch of noise in the process. The journey had just begun, and already I was vibrating with the energy of 12,000 forgotten sentences. My shoes, completely full of sand now, felt like lead weights. The humming was so loud I could feel it resonating in my teeth. I needed to move, to escape the immediate proximity of the history I had just created. But the weight of the beetles in my pockets was profound. I took a tentative step toward the ceiling, hoping the inverted seventh quadrant might provide some solid ground. But all I could hear was the collective, deafening lullaby, insisting that I stop moving and simply drift off into the grainy, unorganized oblivion. I raised the rusty spoon, ready to fend off the next blink, ready for the next spontaneous shift in reality, and simply waited for the inertia to overcome me. The sand in my shoes felt cold. The thing about stone cats is that they are entirely too punctual in their disobedience. It isn't as though they rush the movement. They take their time, shifting the entire geometry of the non-existent aisle with a slow, grinding patience that suggests they have all the time in the world, which is a claim I cannot counter, because time here is either 80 years of low-grade exhaustion or the 3 minutes it takes a single grain of sand to migrate from the back of my hand, where it is functioning as a critical chapter summary, into the threadbare cuff of my borrowed trousers. The transition is seamless, yet utterly disruptive, like realizing your lunch was made entirely of regret. I blinked again. It was a mistake, of course, but the accumulated grit in my eyelids necessitates these resets, these brief blackouts during which the library reconfigures itself. When my vision returned, the aisle that had, moments before, been the section marked Forgotten Histories of Minor Household Appliances had transmogrified into something that looked suspiciously like a deep-sea trench filled with lukewarm pudding and several dozen porcelain goats wearing tiny, stern spectacles. The cats, 3 of them, Ptolemy, Balthazar, and the one I call Margaret because she has a slight chip near her left ear that reminds me of an old aunt who never quite mastered the art of passive aggression, were now sitting precisely where the exit should have been, regarding me with the dull, polished indifference only inanimate felines can truly muster. This does not help with the history of silence. I need the history of silence because it is, theoretically, the lightest book in the entire collection, meaning its forgotten secret should weigh less than a cloud made of discarded intentions. My organization schema demands that the lightest books be positioned near the entrance, even though we have no entrance, and the heaviest books, like the detailed accounting of every moment I said, "Never mind," when I really meant, "You are horribly wrong," need to be stacked near the non-existent loading dock, where the faint, high whine of forgotten promises tends to pool. The current manuscript resting on the back of my left hand, the book known only as The Peculiar Habits of Undisturbed Dust Motes, Volter 90 Hirs, felt marginally heavier than it had a moment ago. This meant, likely, that someone somewhere in the sleeping city had just experienced a very mild, yet profoundly important, shift in their relationship with dust, probably involving a forgotten feather duster, or the sudden memory of an attic they hadn't thought about since the invention of central heating. The weight of a forgotten secret is terribly volatile. I adjusted my grip, or rather, adjusted the angle of my hand. The sand, brilliant white and impossibly fine, settled marginally. It felt cool, like talcum powder left too long near a window pane, but it had the density of pulverized memory. This particular volume of dust motes needed to be weighed before I could pursue silence, and weighing meant the spoon. I reached slowly into my right pocket, navigating past the ever-increasing swarm of glowing beetles. They were humming again, a low, persistent sound pitched somewhere between a distant dental drill and the collective sigh of 1,000 disappointed grandparents. Their light pulsed, casting a faint, erratic glow on the pudding trench and highlighting the unnecessarily detailed muzzles of the porcelain goats. The spoon was there, nestled among the beetles. It was rusty, perpetually cool, and entirely useless for measuring mass, but it was perfect for measuring the ethereal quality of forgotten secrets. It had, after all, been forgotten itself, in a drawer somewhere, for possibly decades, making it highly calibrated to absence. I retrieved it with a sigh that felt like it had originated somewhere deep in the geological layers of my consciousness. The beetles, disturbed by the intrusion of cold metal, intensified their hum and began tapping out a strange rhythm on the inside of my denim. It sounded suspiciously like, "Row, row, row your boat," played backward and slightly off-key. "Quiet, children," I muttered, though the beetles never listen. They are too busy participating in their small, luminous revolution. I held the spoon up. It caught the faint light of the beetles and showed off its impressive patina of orange decay. I then dipped the convex side carefully into the edge of the sandbook, resting on my left hand. I couldn't scoop much. To disturb the sand too aggressively is to risk the entire volume collapsing, instantaneously releasing a torrent of glowing beetles directly into the atmosphere, causing a localized temporary surge of historical data that could theoretically wake up an entire neighborhood, thus dissolving the city. We don't want that. The city existing is the only reason I have a job, even if the job is structurally impossible. I managed to catch maybe 50 grains of sand on the spoon. It didn't look like much, a tiny glittering crescent of historical dust. Now for the measurement. I closed my eyes, another risky move given the stone cats, and focused on the feeling. The weight of the secret, according to the manual I hadn't read in 80 years, manifests as a distinct emotional resonance transmitted through the metal of the spoon. It required total lack of focus, a state of perfect, tired apathy. I waited. The spoon felt dull. Not heavy, not light, just dull. Like waiting for water to boil when you didn't really need tea anyway. This told me a few things about the forgotten secret pertaining to disturbed dust motes. Firstly, the secret was probably mundane. Secondly, it involved a very small amount of low-stakes anxiety. Thirdly, and most importantly for organizational purposes, the dullness meant it was heavier than the book about the philosophy of socks, but decidedly lighter than the comprehensive study on the structural integrity of lukewarm custard. The peculiar habits of undisturbed dust motes, Volner 9 Thus, was, therefore, an H4, or a mild existential nagging category. I carefully flicked the sand grains back onto my hand. They rejoined the main body of the book without incident. If I had accidentally read even one word aloud, say, the or and, those 50 grains would have immediately manifested as 50 new buzzing additions to my pocket cargo, and I simply do not have the carrying capacity for that kind of growth today. My left pocket is already stuffed with the remnants of 2 incomplete biographies of forgotten municipal inspectors, and what I suspect is a complete treatise on the semiotics of broken sidewalk chalk. The pressure is starting to distort the shape of my hip, which is worrisome, as stability is key when dealing with literary physics. I opened my eyes. The stone cats had not moved, but the pudding trench was gone. Now, instead of goats, I was standing at the edge of what appeared to be an endless field of highly organized and somewhat judgmental garden gnomes, all facing slightly west, their plaster expressions conveying deep disapproval of my organizational methods. Ptolemy, Balthazar, and Margaret were now perched atop the tallest gnome, looking down their imaginary noses at my shoes. Ah, yes, the shoes. The accumulation of sand within my footwear is a constant, irritating reminder of the transient nature of knowledge. Every step I take, a little bit of historical data, perhaps a footnote from a long-lost manuscript or a brief annotation concerning the proper handling of fragile metaphors, works its way under my heel. It is the inescapable seepage of the library itself. I shifted my weight, and the resulting crunch of microscopic history under my sole was audible even over the humming of the beetles. It felt like I was walking on finely ground glass mixed with a generous sprinkling of dry impatience. My left shoe felt particularly full now, almost a solid mass of forgotten grammar and missed opportunities. It has reached the point where the sensation is less walking and more shuffling 2 heavy blocks of abstract thought. I desperately needed to find the history of silence. The history of silence is the key to unlocking the central paradox of this place. How can a city built entirely on the deep, unconscious thoughts of sleeping individuals maintain any sort of functional archive of non-thought? The book is rumored to be less sand and more concentrated atmosphere, requiring the lightest of touches and possibly being stored entirely outside the immediate visual spectrum. But it is categorized as A1, pure absence, which is where I need to start cataloging everything else. I sighed, adjusting the sand on my hands again. Carrying 2 books at once is taxing. The one on my right hand is The Cultural Significance of Slightly Bent Cutlery. It's a very emotionally demanding book, far heavier than the Dust Motes volume, ranking somewhere near the middle of the lingering discomfort category. Mostly because slightly bent cutlery evokes a very specific, vague feeling of neglect. "Where is aisle A?" I asked the closest gnome. It did not respond, only tilting its head slightly. An action I am fairly certain was designed purely to suggest that my question was fundamentally flawed. I looked back at the cats. "Did you move aisle A into the gnome field, or did you dissolve it entirely and replace it with this passive-aggressive ceramic tableau?" Ptolemy blinked, the slow, deliberate blink of a highly effective saboteur. I braced myself. When I opened my eyes, the gnomes were gone, replaced by a sheer, shimmering wall of what looked like solidified Monday morning dread, stretching off infinitely in both directions. The cats were gone entirely. This was worse. Moving the aisles is one thing. Replacing the concept of an aisle with an emotional state is entirely unhelpful. I had to move. Movement is technically progress, even if every step scrapes another layer of historical debris from my heel. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, planting my left foot, the one currently encased in a dense block of philosophical sediment, firmly onto the shimmering wall. It did not resist. Instead, my foot sank slightly, and the material of the wall gave off a faint, high-pitched thrum that reverberated up my leg, making my teeth ache. This was not an ideal surface for balancing sand books. My inner monologue began to ramble, which happens often when the structural integrity of the library is questionable. 80 years of this, or 3 minutes. It's irrelevant. The only measure of time here is the rate at which the sand turns into beetles. If I can measure the volume of beetles produced per minute, I can calculate the reading rate of the sleeping consciousness, which then dictates the local velocity of temporal decay. But I haven't measured anything scientifically since 1978, when I attempted to catalog the precise shade of beige that denotes existential futility. And even that ended in tragedy involving a very confused vacuum cleaner and a misplaced metaphor. I focused on the weight in my hands. The cutlery book was starting to feel heavy. Perhaps a sleeping person had just opened a kitchen drawer and felt a sudden, sharp pang of inadequacy over their inability to maintain a proper silverware set. It happens frequently. Small failures carry disproportionate weight in the archives of the subconscious. I needed to check the weight again. I couldn't risk the cutlery book collapsing. It was one of the few reliable indicators of ambient anxiety levels. I carefully extracted the rusty spoon again, maneuvering past the humming cloud in my pocket. The Beatles' lullaby was intensifying now, taking on a more mournful, minor key. It was the kind of song that makes you want to curl up and consider all the things you almost did, but wisely refrained from. I dipped the spoon into the bent cutlery volume. This sand was slightly coarser, almost gritty, the texture suggesting a lack of polish and a general air of neglect. I waited for the resonance. This time, the spoon felt cold. Profoundly, deeply cold, like reaching into a glacier of disappointment. It wasn't the sharp cold of ice, but the bone-aching chill of having expected something better from a situation and finding only stagnation. Ah, a K9. Acute domestic resignation. Much heavier than the dull nagging of the dust motes. This required placement immediately adjacent to the collected excuses for not calling home more often section, which I believe I last saw behind a floating, slightly damp tapestry depicting the history of poorly tied knots. I returned the sand to my right hand. The process had taken approximately 15 minutes of real-world concentration, or, if we adhere to the library's internal clock, about the time it takes for a single regret to fully solidify into a permanent character flaw. Now, where was the tapestry? And, more importantly, where was A1, the history of silence? I blinked. I couldn't help it. The shimmering wall of dread was making my eyes water. The change was immediate and absolute. The wall vanished. I was now standing in what appeared to be a vast, circular room with ceiling heights that defied Euclidean geometry. Everything was colored in a uniform, unsettling shade of muted lavender. In the center of the room, on a pedestal of chipped granite, sat a single, enormous teacup overflowing with perfectly dry sawdust. And there they were, Ptolemy, Balthazar, and Margaret, sitting on the rim of the teacup, their stone bodies utterly still. "You are becoming overtly artistic," I told them, my voice catching slightly on the word artistic. I rarely use adjectives here. They tend to have too much structural integrity. The cats offered no defense. They simply maintained their pose of silent, dusty judgment. I had to assume that the shifting landscape was a passive-aggressive hint. They wanted me to move toward the sawdust teacup. Perhaps the history of silence was hidden beneath the sawdust, or perhaps the sawdust itself was a particularly verbose edition of the history of minor, woodworking mishaps. It was difficult to tell. I took another shuffling step. The sand in my shoes provided the only sense of grounding, a perverse anchor in the shifting landscape. It felt like I was dragging two small concrete boats. I should probably empty my shoes, but that would involve sitting down, and sitting down in this library is functionally equivalent to pressing the large, red Start Over button on the universe. Plus, where would the sand go? Back into the collection. Would a random pile of shoe grit spontaneously organize itself into an encyclopedia of low-level ennui? Possibly. This is the nature of the sleeping archive. I continued toward the teacup. My pace was slow, hampered by the weight of my footbooks and the need to maintain the perfectly level balance of the two volumes on my hands. I held the Dust Motes book on my left hand and the Bent Cutlery book on my right, trying to keep them equidistant from my center line, maintaining a kind of literary equilibrium. It's like carrying two highly volatile liquids that hate each other. The Beatles in my pocket, perhaps sensing the proximity of the cats or the general atmosphere of dry wood, began to hum a new tune. This one was less a lullaby and more a repetitive, insistent sequence of notes that sounded suspiciously like a forgotten phone number. A very important, forgotten phone number, judging by the anxiety it induced. I was getting closer to the teacup. The chipped granite pedestal looked older than the rest of the room, suggesting it had been imported from a much deeper, more established layer of the collective unconscious. Perhaps one where people worried intensely about structural integrity and the proper display of oversized crockery. As I neared the base of the pedestal, I realized the sawdust was not merely dry, It was unnaturally static. It held its shape, defying gravity in small, improbable mounds. I reached out my free hand. Well, my hand that was not currently supporting the weight of a book, and tentatively touched the granite base. It was cool and smooth. "Is aisle A in here?" I asked the teacup, knowing full well it would not answer, being entirely too busy containing highly structured dry wood. Ptolemy twitched his non-existent whiskers. And then I saw it. Tucked into the slight shadow cast by the chipped edge of the teacup was a very small, very rusty spoon. It was almost identical to mine, but perhaps a little older, a little more resigned. 2 spoons. This meant I was either very close to something profound, or I had stumbled into a localized anomaly dedicated solely to the history of poorly maintained cutlery used for metaphysical measurements. Given my luck, it was probably the latter. I bent down slightly, fighting the pull of the sand in my shoes, and gingerly nudged the stray spoon with my own. The moment the 2 rusty metals touched, a brief, sharp static electricity discharged. It wasn't loud, but it caused the beetles in my pockets to flash brightly, momentarily overriding their soft humming with a collective, frantic zzz. And then the sawdust shifted. Not dramatically, not like the stone cats move the aisles, but internally, subtly, as though the grains were breathing. A tiny crevice opened in the sawdust mountain, leading into the heart of the teacup. It looked promising, or terrifyingly deceptive. I slowly backed away, needing to assess the situation before plunging my arm into a container of potential historical confusion. If that is a trap, I want you to know that 80 years of being constantly tired has rendered me entirely immune to surprise, I informed the stone cats. Balthazar leaned slightly, as if attempting to maintain visual contact with the sawdust crack. I looked at the crevice again. It was the exact width of a hand, inviting yet suspicious. It smelled faintly of old linen and existential dread, which is, admittedly, the characteristic odor of most high-value archives in the sleeping city. The weight of the books on my hands suddenly intensified. The bent cutlery volume felt like a lead weight, signaling a massive surge in unresolved domestic issues somewhere in the sleeping population. The weight shift was destabilizing my posture. I had to weigh it again, quickly, or risk a catastrophic sand collapse. I dipped the spoon into the cutlery book. This time there was no dullness, no subtle chill. This time the spoon felt hot. Burning hot, radiating a frantic, nervous energy straight into my palm. L14. Immediate, unresolved kitchen rage. We were dealing with a crisis level of domestic disturbance. This book needed to be moved immediately to the flammable metaphors section, which I vaguely remember being located beneath the municipal ice rink that only exists on Tuesdays. But I couldn't move yet. I was distracted by the crevice. I took a deep breath, the air here tasting faintly of unused metaphors and damp plaster. I needed to focus. The history of silence. A1. The lightest book, the antithesis of this searing kitchen rage. It should be here, near the epicenter of structural chaos, a counterpoint of profound quietude. I looked at the crack in the sawdust. It had narrowed slightly, perhaps sensing my hesitation. I needed to read a word aloud, just one, to see if the sawdust was sand. If it turned into beetles, I would know it was a book, and I could determine its contents by the texture of the beetle carapace. Kitchen rage beetles usually have a slightly greasy, agitated look. Silence beetles should theoretically be translucent, maybe even sound dampening. but reading means sacrificing my current volumes. I cannot afford to lose the Dust Motes book. It is the only one I have that chronicles the correct philosophical alignment of microscopic airborne particles. And if we lose that knowledge, the entire city might spontaneously develop allergies to nuance. I looked down at my shoes. The sand was up to my ankles now. It was pressing uncomfortably against my shin bones. I could feel the individual grains shifting, grinding against the fibers of my socks, probably reciting fragments of forgotten poetry. This relentless, irritating accumulation was starting to drain my limited reserves of apathetic energy. I had to get rid of the heavy book first. I had to place the L14 Kitchen Rage book somewhere safe. I took one more step, shuffling toward where the lavender wall had been, trying to remember the direction of the non-existent ice rink. As I did so, one of the porcelain cats, Margaret, suddenly moved. Not the large geographical movement I dread, but a small internal shudder, and then she fell off the rim of the teacup, landing with a soft thump into the sawdust. The sawdust crevice instantly snapped shut. Ptolemy and Balthazar stared straight ahead, entirely ignoring Margaret's sudden collapse. I stopped dead. "Did you just knock over your colleague?" No answer. I looked at the teacup. The sawdust was now smooth again, undisturbed. Margaret was gone, presumably absorbed into the volume, perhaps instantly catalogued as the failure of collaborative effort. I felt a surge of genuine, albeit very low-grade, annoyance. If the cats are now sacrificing themselves to move the environment, this entire operation is escalating beyond the realm of predictable absurdity. I held the searing, hot, rage-filled sand on my right hand and the dull dust mote sand on my left. I needed to recalibrate. The sudden disappearance of Margaret meant a surge of unpredictable data. I dipped the spoon into the Dust Motes book one last time. It felt warm now. Gently, almost solicitously warm. The secret of the Dust Motes had shifted. Someone, somewhere, had just looked at an undisturbed surface and felt a momentary comforting realization that not everything in the universe requires immediate maintenance. C2. Benign neglect. Much lighter than before. I let out a slow, tired breath. The beetles in my pocket responded with an incredibly slow, drawn-out zzz that sounded like they were contemplating the infinite majesty of lint. I still needed to move the rage book, and I still needed to find silence. And now, the cats were playing architectural Russian roulette. This was going to take longer than 3 minutes, possibly longer than 80 years. And I was increasingly certain I would have to remove my shoes soon, if only to prevent my feet from fully ossifying into historical artifacts. The grit was starting to itch right behind my toes, a maddening sensation, like a tiny chorus of forgotten footnotes demanding attention. I decided the only logical path forward was to ignore the heavy book for a moment and focus on the teacup. The sawdust must be the temporary repository for the history of silence, placed there by the cats specifically to irritate me. I approached the teacup again, taking care not to disturb Ptolemy or Balthazar. They were focused on an invisible point somewhere over my left shoulder, probably observing a historical anomaly related to the curvature of space-time or the price of butter in 1954. I held the cutlery book steady. The heat had subsided slightly, moving from rage to mild resentment. Perhaps the sleeping person had put the bent fork down and decided to use a different one instead of starting a philosophical argument with themselves. I reached toward the sawdust. If it was silence, touching it might result in a profound sense of peace, or maybe just instantaneous disintegration. Both outcomes seemed preferable to standing here arguing with ceramics. My fingertips brushed the dry, finely textured surface. It was soft, almost powdery, but cold, intensely cold, like the metallic chill of absence. And then I felt the familiar tingling resonance of the rusty spoon radiating from the sawdust itself. This was definitely a book. A very large, possibly infinite book, bound not by covers but by the constraint of the teacup. But what was it? I didn't dare read a word. I had to use the spoon. I held my breath, slowly balancing the 2 sand volumes with exquisite care, and gently, with the tip of the rusty spoon, I scooped up a minuscule amount of the sawdust. It fell onto the spoon with an almost undetectable tick. I focused. I waited for the emotional resonance. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No weight, no cold, no heat, no dullness, no itching, no sense of time or place or purpose. It was the purest form of non-existence I had ever encountered. It was the negative space around a thought. A1. Pure absence. The history of silence. I had found it. The relief was immediately countered by the immense organizational problem it presented. How do you catalog nothing? How do you weigh zero? The organizational structure collapses if the starting point is mathematically impossible. I stared at the microscopic pile of silence on the spoon. It felt like the perfect solution to all my problems, which is precisely why it was so utterly dangerous. The beetles in my pocket seemed to recognize the quality of the discovery. Their humming stopped completely. For the first time in what felt like centuries, there was true silence in the library, save for the faint crunch of historical data beneath my heavily burdened feet. Ptolemy and Balthazar remained motionless, but I sensed their stone approval. They hadn't moved the aisle this time. They had simply led me to the 0 point. Now, I needed to figure out how to shelve the infinite volume of absence contained within a ceramic teacup, without disturbing the structural integrity of the entire sleeping city. It was, I realized, the central dilemma of my absurd profession. And I was tired. So deeply, profoundly tired. The sand in my shoes felt like it was starting to sprout roots. I returned the sawdust, the silence, to the teacup. It settled back into the surface without a ripple. I still had 2 heavy books in my hands, and one of them was approaching spontaneous combustion due to repressed domestic fury. I looked at the silence book, then at the cats, and finally at the heat emanating from my right hand. The only way to proceed was to create a new category for things that weigh nothing, yet contain everything. I decided to call it the unbearable lightness of being ignored. This felt suitably verbose and meaningless. I took one last, slow, deliberate step away from the teacup, leaving Ptolemy and Balthazar to guard the history of silence. I needed to find that tapestry depicting poorly tied knots, because the flammable metaphor section was the only place appropriate for the Kitchen Rage book. I blinked. The lavender room vanished. I was now standing waist deep in a shallow pond of tepid, greenish water. Floating on the surface were hundreds of identical, slightly chipped dominoes, arranged in perfect concentric circles. And the cats? They were now sitting on the horizon, miles away, looking like 3 very small, highly decorative lumps of dissatisfaction. The aisles had been replaced by geometry. I sighed, the sound echoing hollowly across the domino pond. My shoes, already full of dry sand, were now instantly saturated. The weight increased exponentially. I was no longer walking on historical data, I was dragging 2 lead sponges filled with forgotten moments. The itching sensation behind my toes intensified. It was no longer a footnote. It was a full-blown argument between 2 very obscure historical figures about the relative merits of using a comma versus a semicolon. I must find that tapestry. I had to. The heat from the cutlery book was becoming painful. It felt like the sand grains were beginning to weld themselves to my skin. I shuffled forward through the water, disrupting the perfect concentric circles of dominoes. The movement caused a soft, clacking sound that was almost loud enough to drown out the renewed, low humming of the beetles in my pocket. They were back to their off-key rendition of "Row, row, row your boat." It seemed the moment of perfect silence was over. The sleeping mind, it appeared, abhorred a vacuum, even one filled with historical information. This was going to be a long night. Or perhaps just 3 more minutes. It didn't really matter. The only certainty was the absurd weight of the secrets and the inescapable grit of the sand between my toes. I just wanted to find the tapestry before the cutlery book exploded, turning the pond of dominoes into an immense, steaming lake of aggressively organized beetles. The weight of a forgotten secret is perhaps the heaviest thing in the universe, which is a frankly preposterous idea considering that if something is forgotten, it shouldn't logically possess mass, let alone the kind of dense gravitational pull that suggests I need to measure it with the bowl of a very rusty spoon. And yet, here I am, perpetually leaning slightly to the left, which is the side of my body that currently bears the brunt of a volume I suspect contains the memory of why people insist on wearing socks that don't match. An administrative oversight in the cosmic filing system that somehow weighs more than the concept of infinity. The sand on the back of my hands, the actual book, is remarkably fine today. It's like powdered moonlight, if moonlight had been thoroughly pulverized and then steeped in silence for about 9 centuries. It doesn't look heavy, but then weight here is subjective, a negotiation between the sleeping mind and the damp basement of the subconscious. If I shift my gaze too quickly, the individual grains feel like tiny, cold insects struggling against the curvature of my knuckles. I have to keep the balance perfect, the subtle slope of my tendons acting as the only topographical barrier preventing an entire treatise on minor architectural mistakes from cascading into the already ankle-deep drift that is currently migrating up my left shoe. It's the left shoe that suffers most. It's a low-cut Oxford, ostensibly brown, though the color is debatable, as everything here exists in a perpetual state of twilight gray and the overwhelming white of the sand. The sand collects first just above the heel, settling with an almost mournful sigh. Then it slowly, meticulously fills the arch, pressing against the sock that I know, definitively, is blue, even though I cannot see the color. The steady accumulation is the city's way of reminding me that I am stationary, that even movement is a lie in a place sustained only by the collective unconscious taking a nap. I had been aiming for the theoretical location where the aisle dedicated to quiet historical events should reside. This is where I anticipate finding the complete and utter history of silence, a legendary volume rumored to be made of highly compressed shadow and therefore impossible to balance. But I need to look anyway. It's a point of professional pride, even if my profession is a custodial act performed in a temporal paradox, while my pockets slowly fill with glowing scarab beetles that smell faintly of ozone and old paper. The beetles, by the way, are humming louder now. They reside in the deep, linty recess of my trousers. They don't just hum a note. They hum a specific, tedious melody, a repetitive 7-note sequence that I have identified as the opening bars to The Lullaby of Slightly Regrettable Decisions. It's soothing, but in the way that white noise is soothing. It masks the sound of my own existential fatigue, but it doesn't actually stop the fatigue from happening. They are providing the soundtrack to the slow disintegration of my sense of purpose. I close my eyes for what I estimate to be 32 seconds, primarily to relieve the dry grit that seems to permanently coat the surface of my eyeballs. This is a rookie mistake. A terrible, fundamental, 80 years of experience should have taught me better error. When I open them, the geography has fundamentally rearranged itself. The stone cats have been busy. The stone cats are simply the worst element of my working life. They are heavy, life-sized statues of various breeds, a particularly smug Siamese, a perpetually frowning Persian, and an inscrutable Sphinx that stand sentinel over the non-existent aisles. They aren't supposed to move. They are supposed to maintain the structural integrity of the conceptual space. But every time I blink, or even experience a momentary lapse in attention, they pivot slightly, shuffling the invisible theoretical pathways. The aisle I was just in, the one bordered by the concept of unfinished sentences and the heavy, burdensome reality of forgotten names, is gone. In its place, stretching out into the hazy distance, is an alleyway I have never catalogued. It is too narrow to be an aisle. It's more of a damp corridor, choked with volumes of sand that look suspiciously like poorly filtered memories of rainstorms. I sigh. It's a deep, chest-caving sigh, the kind that expels 50% of your available energy reserves. I adjust the sandbook on my right hand, a slender volume of Minor Misunderstandings of Maritime Law, and reach into my coat pocket to retrieve the rusty spoon. The spoon is crucial. It's silver-plated, but the silver gave up the ghost around the time I started measuring the weight of doubt, and now it's just pure, flaky iron oxide. I use the spoon to gently scoop a single grain of sand off the forgotten socks book on my left hand. This grain, when held up to the diffuse light, represents a single forgotten secret. My mission is to determine if the weight of this secret, in relation to the main body of the volume, is appropriately classified. If the spoon trembles too much, the secret is too heavy, and the book needs to be shifted 3 theoretical yards toward the section on unnecessary gravity. If it feels light, almost buoyant, then it is misplaced and probably belongs in ephemeral intentions. I hold the grain. It feels exactly like a single microscopic grain of sand. The system is flawed. The scale is non-existent. The measurement is pointless. But routine is the only thing tethering me to the illusion of reality. So I continue. As I attempt this delicate, tedious transfer, I notice the occupant of the new, illegitimate aisle. He is positioned in the corner, crouched low near a puddle that appears to have leaked down from the ceiling, even though this structure has no ceiling, only an infinite expanse of gray air. He is deeply, profoundly engaged in his task. He is meticulously, painstakingly attempting to measure the puddle. He is a man of uncertain age, dressed in attire that suggests he once had a job requiring a waistcoat. But the waistcoat is now stained the color of weak tea, and smells faintly of mold spores and old rubber. His hair is meticulously slicked back, giving him a perpetually startled look, and he is wearing industrial-strength waders that seem entirely inappropriate for the environment. He is, however, armed with the essential tools of his own private, useless trade. He carries a clipboard made of compressed algae, a small, highly polished brass level that looks like it hasn't registered level since the Pleistocene era. And, most prominently, he holds a single, specialized piece of optical equipment balanced precariously over his nose. This is my encounter. The necessary, bizarre intrusion. Goodness, I mutter, mostly to the scarabs, who respond with a slightly higher-pitched whine. Another one. He doesn't look up immediately. His concentration is total. He uses a dropper, the kind reserved for precise chemical titration, to move a single molecule of water from the center of the puddle to the edge. He watches the movement with the intensity of a cartographer attempting to redefine the continental drift. I clear my throat, a dry, gravelly sound that briefly interrupts the monotonous rhythm of the humming. He finally raises his head, rotating his neck with a slow, deliberate creak that suggests calcification. His eyes are magnified to an alarming size by the piece of equipment he is wearing. A monocle. Not a simple reading monocle, but a complex, brass-rimmed instrument, held in place by an elaborate system of wires and elastic bands wrapped around his skull. This is, I recognize the title from a discarded index card I found 3 years ago, or perhaps 30 minutes ago. The timeline is flexible. Wedged beneath the paw of the Siamese cat. I apologize for the disturbance, I say, keeping my voice low. If I speak too loudly, the vibrations could destabilize the sandbook about maritime law, and I simply don't have the energy to reorganize nautical mistakes right now. I seem to have been repositioned by the cats. I was looking for the historical silence. The registrar blinks slowly, the monocle giving his face a distorted, slightly wet look. He surveys me, his gaze lingering entirely too long on the way the sand is pouring over the lip of my shoe. Silence, he echoes, the word heavy and flat, as if he were tasting a foreign, unpleasant substance. A difficult volume to classify, it lacks measurable humidity. That is generally the point of silence, I respond, trying to inject a sliver of practical logic into the conversation, a foolish endeavor. No, you misunderstand the filing structure here, the registrar says, carefully setting down his titration dropper onto the damp algae clipboard. He doesn't move from his crouch. The weight of a forgotten secret is intrinsically linked to the latent moisture it retains. Secrets that are forgotten quickly, those are dry, brittle things, easily dispersed. They belong in the air currents. He gestures vaguely upwards toward the theoretical ceiling. But the secrets that linger, the truly heavy ones, those are the secrets that weep. They harbor dampness. They pull the atmospheric pressure down until they settle, like this puddle. Therefore, silence, lacking internal precipitation, must be filed under theoretical concepts of non-weight. You won't find it near the forgotten socks. I knew I shouldn't have argued about the inherent dryness of silence. It only leads to semantic detours that consume valuable moments of consciousness. I appreciate the classification guidance, I say, adjusting the rust spoon balance. But I still need to know where theoretical concepts of non-weight is located, assuming the stone felines haven't dragged it into the section on things we pretended we didn't see happen. The registrar sighs, and the elastic bands holding his monocle vibrate slightly. He finally rises, a slow, rheumatic unfolding of joints. He stands perhaps 5 feet high, and the waders come up to his chest, making him look like a very sad, very old rubber duck. It moves, he confirms, nodding sagely. Everything moves. The cats are agents of necessary instability. They prevent the library from achieving perfect classification. which would, of course, necessitate our immediate non-existence. They are performing their duty, however irritatingly. He gestures toward his face, tapping the elaborate monocle. This is why I require precision. I am measuring the exact rate of evaporation of the puddle. It is the only metric that truly matters. If the puddle evaporates too quickly, it signifies a dangerous increase in collective wakefulness. If it holds, we have achieved adequate slumber levels. I look at the puddle. It looks like a puddle. It is probably still evaporating at whatever rate water usually evaporates when it feels like it. And what exactly does that specific piece of equipment measure? I ask, indicating the complex optical device. It looks far too specialized for puddle observation. He leans in conspiratorially, lowering his voice to a whisper that sounds like wet sandpaper. The humming beetles in my pocket react, accelerating their lullaby tempo slightly. This, my friend, he says, touching the lens reverently, is the I wait. I assume there is a follow-up sentence explaining the utility of this function. There is not. And are there many dust motes resembling ancient Roman numerals in this vicinity? I prompt him. Oh, legions of them, he confirms, adjusting the elastic band, which seems to be cutting off the circulation to his left earlobe. But they are invisible to the naked eye. They represent the chronological residue of forgotten bureaucratic processes, the paperwork that the universe filed and then promptly misplaced. Their patterns are crucial. They tell me if the forgetting process is proceeding in an orderly, numerically sequential fashion, or if we have jumped a century or two. One cannot measure the dampness of oblivion if the timeline itself is skipping. I nod, accepting the logic, because in this library, the existence of dust motes that resemble ancient Roman numerals and serve as chronological markers for misplaced universal paperwork is no more absurd than the fact that my entire collection is made of sand that turns into singing insects. I see, I say wearily. And how is the chronology looking? Wretched, he sighs. Absolutely wretched. Just moments ago, I detected a cluster of particles clearly forming the number CLX-ISAF. That's 174. We shouldn't be back at 174. We were operating perfectly fine around MMCCC6LBAs 2348. We've slipped catastrophically. The cats have moved more than the aisles. They've moved the temporal bookmarks. He shakes his head mournfully. He then does something unexpected. He unclasps the elaborate wiring system, carefully detaching the Roman numeral monocle from his weary face. You need structure, he states, holding out the monocle toward me. It is heavy brass, slightly cold, and smells faintly of ozone and mildewed silk. You are trying to measure the weight of a secret, a completely arbitrary metric with a rusty piece of cutlery. That is unstable. You need visual confirmation of underlying order, even if the order itself is entirely meaningless. He presses the monocle into my free hand, the one not holding the spoon, but the one still balancing the sand volume on maritime law. Take this, he insists. You can't wear it over your hands, obviously. You'd spill the book. But carry it. Hold it close. It won't help you find the silence, because silence doesn't adhere to numerical patterns, but it might help you feel slightly more organized while you fail. It is a useless item, designed for a useless purpose, but perhaps its sheer specificity will anchor your mind in this chaotic regression to the year 174. I stare down at the brass optic. It feels surprisingly solid, a heavy piece of unnecessary engineering. It is entirely useless for measuring sand, for finding silence, or for preventing stone cats from redefining Euclidean geometry with their casual steps. "Thank you, Registrar," I say, tucking the monocle carefully into my jacket pocket, right next to the colony of humming beetles. The monocle immediately conducts the beetle chorus, and the brass begins to vibrate against my rib cage with a faint, buzzing enthusiasm. The registrar immediately crouches down again, pulling out a much smaller non-monocle eyepiece to resume his surveillance of the puddle, looking for the telltale shimmer of a newly evaporating water molecule. His attention span has reset. He has completed his designated act of nonsense for the day by gifting me the useless item. I turn my attention back to the problem at hand: the sand, the spoon, and the search for the history of non-sound. The encounter has cost me exactly 9 minutes of perceived time, and I am now approximately 3 aisles further away from where I started. But I have gained a new complication: a monocle calibrated for defunct Roman numerals. I pull out the rusty spoon again. The initial grain of sand, the forgotten secret about the mismatched socks, is still nestled precariously in the bowl. I must now incorporate the existence of the Roman numeral monocle into the weight measurement. Does the sheer pointlessness of the monocle add or subtract from the perceived weight of a forgotten secret? Pointlessness often carries a surprising gravitational heft in this city. A truly pointless object is a testament to the dedication of the unconscious mind to unnecessary detail, and therefore it should be heavy. I press the tip of the spoon lightly against the brass monocle in my pocket, attempting a bizarre form of conceptual triangulation. The entire process is maddeningly slow. Every movement requires pre-calculation. I cannot blink, or the cats will pivot the hallway into a 90-degree angle, and I will end up in the section dedicated to the vague anxiety felt just before waking up. I must maintain the perfect curvature of my hands to keep the books balanced. I must listen to the specific harmonic distortions caused by the beetles' humming to determine if they are happy or merely resigned. And now I must consider the temporal implications of Roman numeral dust particles floating around the measurement of a forgotten textile preference. I decide that the inclusion of the monocle must, logically, add weight. If the secret of the mismatched socks is now filtered through a lens of chronologically misplaced bureaucratic debris, it becomes heavier, burdened by the history of unnecessary administration. I shift the sand volume on my left hand slightly toward my center of gravity. This movement, maybe 1 millimeter, signifies the reclassification of the book into the heavier category. It is now filed under Forgotten Secrets, weighted down by unnecessary historical context. Mission, momentarily, accomplished. I take a breath. The air here tastes like old linen and distant thunderstorms. It's the flavor of a memory that is currently being misfiled. I need to move, but moving is dangerous. I choose the only direction available to me: forward, down the damp, newly created corridor that smells strongly of registrar and regret. I take one tiny, shuffling step. The sand in my left shoe shifts, settling with a heavy, cold weight around my toes. It feels like wearing lead weights disguised as comfortable footwear. I look ahead. The corridor extends into a milky white haze. There is no indication of theoretical concepts of non-weight. I am now firmly lodged in the detour phase, trapped between a damp puddle and the philosophical implications of obsolete counting systems. I shuffle again. 1 millimeter. The beetles increase the tempo of their 7-note lullaby. The brass monocle vibrates. If I walk 3 more paces, I will be out of the registrar's immediate surveillance zone, and perhaps the cats will be kind enough to replace this damp corner with an area slightly more conducive to high-level, nonsensical librarianship, like perhaps the archives of Things Said While Half Asleep, or the notoriously light section on Promises Made Under Duress. But 3 paces is a monumental journey in the city of slumber. It means 3 opportunities for the stone cats to redraw the map. It means 3 moments of potential catastrophe for my balancing act. It means 3 more influxes of grit into my already saturated shoe. I decide to take the risk. I need silence. I need the lack of sound to counter the relentless humming of the Beatles, which has begun to sound distinctly like a warning siren played through a wet cloth. I raise my right foot, executing the movement with the slow, agonizing precision of an astronaut performing a repair outside the airlock, and as my foot clears the ground, suspended for a fraction of a second, I see it. Not an aisle, not a corridor, but a small circular depression in the ground, about the size of a tea saucer, just ahead of me. And sitting perfectly centered in this depression is a discarded umbrella. Not just any umbrella. This one is covered entirely in feathers, small, gray, damp feathers. This is undoubtedly the next bizarre element, the signal that the detour is deepening. I slowly lower my foot, setting it down with exaggerated care. The umbrella of feathers. It looks extraordinarily heavy, despite the lightness implied by its exterior. The feathers are thick and waterlogged. As I approach the object, another figure emerges, crawling out from beneath a collapsed theoretical wall that appears to be constructed solely of dusty intentions. This character is even more unusual than the registrar. He is flat. Not figuratively flat, but dimensionally reduced. He looks like a cartoon drawing of a man that has been poorly laminated and then shoved into a narrow slot for 80 years. His movements are jerky, two-dimensional, like a badly rendered sprite in an outdated video game. He slides rather than walks. He is clutching the handle of the feathery umbrella with both flat hands, attempting to pull it further back beneath the collapsed wall. "Excuse me," I whisper, the sound immediately absorbed by the feathery surface of the umbrella. The flat man stops struggling and rotates his entire body, like a piece of paper spinning on an invisible axis, to face me. His features, large, round eyes, a perpetually surprised expression, are stretched wide across his two-dimensional plane. "Are you attempting to steal the umbrella of confounding mass?" he asks, his voice sounding thin and reedy, as if transmitted through an old radio speaker. "Steal? No. I was merely cataloging the object," I respond, trying to sound official. "I am the librarian. Everything must be categorized by the weight of a forgotten secret." The flat man slides closer, his entire structure wobbling slightly as he navigates the uneven surface of the sand. "Weight is irrelevant," he states, leaning in so close that I can feel the faint, paper-like stiffness of his form brushing against my elbow. "This is a device of volume displacement, not mass." "Volume displacement of what?" I ask. "Slightly awkward silences," he replies, as if the answer should be obvious. My job is to gather and compress the silences that occur when two people know they should say something but choose not to. The truly dense, thick silence that fills a room after an inappropriate joke. Or the silence between two distant relatives at a funeral. He pats the umbrella. This is the collection device. The feathers, when sufficiently saturated with unsaid words, achieve a critical density. Then I transport them to the repository of lingering discomfort. I look at the umbrella. It is heavy, damp, and now slightly pulsing with the rhythmic thrumming of my internal beatles. It looks very heavy, I observe. It should be, the flat man agrees, sliding back slightly to admire his burden. You wouldn't believe the density of the silence surrounding the topic of inherited debt. It weighs a ton, or, dimensionally speaking, it takes up about 3.5 cubic feet of unexpressed anxiety. "And what is your item?" I ask, gesturing toward his other hand. He is holding something small and perfectly round, a clear sphere that glows with a dim internal light. He holds it up proudly. This is the most crucial tool of my trade. It is the I Lean Closer. It's about the size of a large marble, and inside the glass, tiny, indiscernible shapes seem to swirl lazily. It measures how long a person takes to respond to a fundamentally uncomfortable question, he explains, rotating the sphere. When the hesitation exceeds 7 seconds, the orb retains the residual pause, turning it into physical matter. I then apply that matter to the feathers of the umbrella to increase its silence saturation. The orb of measured hesitation. Perfectly specific. Perfectly useless to a librarian who organizes by the conceptual weight of secrets. The flat man notices my rusty spoon, still cradling the single grain of sand. "You are wasting your time with mass," he admonishes, his flat face expressing profound pity. "You should be classifying by interval." How long ago was the secret forgotten? A secret forgotten 5 minutes ago is dimensionally thicker than one forgotten 80 years ago. The longer it has been gone, the more compressed, and therefore the less volume it occupies. He then does precisely what the registrar did. He unclasps the useless item and presents it to me. "Take this," he insists, pushing the orb of measured hesitation into my hand. It is warm and smooth. It won't help you find silence. You are looking for the history of silence, which is a void, not a delay. But it will help you quantify the gaps in your search. You can measure the hesitation between one blink and the next, and if that pause is too long, the stone cats will move the entire concept of finding into the archives of futile pursuits. He presses the orb firmly into my palm, right next to the brass monocle in my pocket, causing a minor conceptual collision. "Use it to monitor your delays," he concludes, before sliding awkwardly back beneath the rubble of dusty intentions, disappearing behind the massive, feathery bulk of the umbrella of confounding mass. I stand there, arms slightly aching, now carrying 3 books of sand, a rusty spoon, a colony of humming beetles, a brass monocle calibrated for defunct Roman numerals, and a warm, glowing orb of measured hesitation. The mission has been significantly compromised by the sheer influx of unnecessary, highly specialized equipment. I look at the orb. I am supposed to use this to measure the hesitation between my blinks. This will require another layer of concentration I simply don't possess. I am 80 years old, or perhaps 3 minutes, and my feet are getting increasingly heavy with the weight of misfiled nautical law. I tuck the orb into my other pocket. The beetles, sensing the new company, divide their time between humming the lullaby and emitting small, curious clicks against the glass surface of the orb. I take a deep, weary breath. I have not made any progress in finding the history of silence. I have only found the history of unnecessary objects and the philosophical basis for damp corners and awkward conversational gaps. I must now decide how the orb of measured hesitation impacts the weight of the forgotten secret on the spoon. If hesitation is measured volume, does it counteract mass? Does a secret that was forgotten quickly, low hesitation, weigh more or less than a secret that took years to suppress, high hesitation. I briefly consider measuring the hesitation between taking this step and the next step. I watch the swirling shapes inside the orb. I wait. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. My shoes are nearly full of sand now. The grit is rising past my ankle bone, pressing against the skin. I ignore the orb. I am too tired for advanced dimensional mathematics. I decide that the inclusion of the orb, representing the universal acknowledgement of delay, must cancel out the weight added by the Roman numeral monocle. The uncertainty of time and space must therefore bring the weight of the forgotten secret about the mismatched socks back to 0. A neutral object. I gently shake the sand grain back onto the volume of forgotten secrets weighted down by unnecessary historical context. It settles perfectly. The classification is now moot, as its net conceptual weight is 0. I turn my attention back to the direction of the non-existent aisle. I need to get out of this ridiculous detour and find the archives of non-sound. I take a final, definitive step forward, finally leaving the damp, flat domain of the registrar and the collector. I blink. I can't help it. The dryness is unbearable. The stone cats have done their work. When I open my eyes, I am standing on the edge of a massive, circular pit. The sand floor drops away steeply, and at the very bottom of the pit, there is something that looks suspiciously like a perfectly polished silver scale, glistening under the oppressive gray light. A genuine scale. I almost drop the maritime law book in sheer surprise. A scale. A functioning, non-spoon measurement device. But before I can process this miracle of useful engineering, a voice echoes up from the pit, hollow and resonating, as if the speaker were using the earth itself as a megaphone. Do not attempt to weigh anything. That scale is calibrated only for the mass of unopened correspondence. It will give you false readings on anything involving textile preferences or silent history. I sigh. I pull the rusty spoon out of my pocket, ignoring the renewed chorus of the humming beetles, and prepare to spend the next several hours discussing the administrative logistics of unread letters with whoever is down in the pit. The search for silence continues to be loud, heavy, and exhausting. I can feel the weight of 80 years settling squarely on my shoulders, or perhaps that's just the maritime law. It doesn't really matter. I just need a moment of true, unclassified, un-beetle-hummed quiet. The history of silence. That was the phrase that had been clinging to the back of my mind like a damp scrap of tracing paper for what felt like the duration of a minor geologic era. Or perhaps just the time it took for the last cup of lukewarm library coffee, which wasn't coffee at all but mostly distilled boredom, to finally evaporate from the non-existent saucer. 80 years, 3 minutes. The unit of time doesn't actually matter when your temporal marker is the rate at which fine white silica, the remnants of someone else's half-remembered dreams, fills the internal cavity of your left shoe. My left shoe is nearly full now. It has a specific, weighted slosh to it that the right one, blessedly, has not yet achieved. And that asymmetry of weight distribution is, I think, the most exciting thing to happen this century. The beetles in my pockets were certainly excited, though. They were humming Vol. 2 of the mandatory lullaby repertoire, the one that sounds suspiciously like a broken calliope being played inside a wet sock. They hummed louder every time a grain of sand, turned luminous and chitinous by my accidental reading of an internalized sentence fragment, something about the correct application of a hinge, rolled off the sloping landscape of the book, balanced on the back of my right hand and into the dark fabric abyss of my cargo pants. These sand books, the repositories of all knowledge that only manifests when the waking world closes its weary eyes, required absolute concentration to maintain, which is precisely why I failed at it constantly. The book, currently threatening to become an army of tiny, buzzing pocket insects, was titled The Subtleties of Unintentional Architecture, and it was exceedingly heavy. Not physically, of course. It weighed nothing, being mere dust, but its conceptual weight, the weight of a forgotten secret, was immense. I could feel the density of the forgetting pressing down on the tendons in my wrist. This was, naturally, the entire point of my employment, to organize these ephemeral volumes, not by title or Dewey Decimal or color, but by the precise gravity of their unremembered content. I needed a scale. The scale I possessed was a rusty spoon. I held the spoon, a lovely, pitted thing, tarnished by the moisture of 1,000 forgotten tears, in my left hand, which was also trying to balance 3 separate treaties on the etiquette of competitive yawning. I tried to focus the spoon. The spoon wasn't calibrated, nor was the weight consistent, since rust flakes occasionally detached and introduced tiny micro-fluctuations in the mass. But the crucial thing was the intent. The organization wasn't about physics. It was about the moral heft of the neglect contained within the sand. I gingerly scooped a few dozen grains from the center mound of the architecture book. The grains were brilliant white, almost painful to look at, and they piled in the bowl of the spoon. I squinted. "Now, are you heavy with forgetting?" I murmured to the spoon. "Or are you light with indifference?" The spoon merely reflected the dim, pervasive non-light of the library, which is essentially just the aggregated shine of everyone else's sleeping regret. I waited for an answer. Usually, the spoon would give off a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration, the specific frequency of which corresponded to an organizational category. Epsilon for mild inconvenience, Delta Prime for catastrophic but entirely avoidable historical mistake, and the much-coveted Zeta -9 for secrets so thoroughly annihilated by collective amnesia that they barely qualified as having existed at all. Today, the spoon just felt cold. Useless, I sighed, letting the sand grains trickle back onto the main mound, where they instantly reintegrated into the text structure. No new beetles appeared, which meant I hadn't accidentally read anything during the weighing process, a minor triumph in this specific dimension of exhaustion. My immediate problem, however, was not the classification system. That was a perpetual, low-grade background hum of frustration I had long since incorporated into my circulatory system. But the 3 stone cats. The stone cats were not actual cats. They were figures carved from a gray, igneous rock that felt unsettlingly soft when you stubbed your toe on them, and they existed solely to disrupt my spatial coherence. I was searching for the history of silence. A book I knew, with the certainty of a man who has lost his keys in the same place every day for 80 years, was located somewhere adjacent to the section on hypothetical oceanography, and directly across from the monographs on the optimal pressure for crushing felt hats. I was sure I had seen the faint outline of the silence section just a moment ago. It was usually marked by a lack of the ambient beetle hum and a specific chill in the air, the kind that suggests someone just opened a window onto a Tuesday in 1954. I blinked. It was a slow, deliberate blink, because I knew what was coming. Blinking here is like hitting the random shuffle button on the universe's filing system. When my eyelids lifted, the section on hypothetical oceanography was gone. In its place stood a towering, wobbling pile of books dedicated entirely to the subject of why do we keep thinking about pigeons? And there they were, the 3 stone cats. They hadn't moved their physical forms. They were still perched on the plinth that wasn't there before I blinked. But their silent, stony gazes suggested a deeply satisfied shift in the fundamental structure of the library's coordinates. The largest cat, the one whose posture suggested it was constantly judging my choice of footwear, seemed to be holding a tiny, invisible wrench in its paw, clearly having just tightened the spatial rotation mechanism. "You know," I told the cats, tilting my head back so the sand on my hands wouldn't slide off, "this is inefficient. Truly, if you have an objection to the proximity of the pigeons to the hats, perhaps we could use an index card system. Or perhaps you could simply communicate your feelings using the established framework of polite, non-Euclidean discourse, rather than engaging in these constant, tiresome dimensional inversions." The cats offered no response, only the cold, impenetrable density of granite that has witnessed entirely too much organizational incompetence. I sighed. A long, weary exhalation that stirred up a small dust devil of forgotten acronyms from the floor. I had to assume that the history of silence was now located somewhere near the section on mouth harps and their socioeconomic impact. I began walking, or rather shuffling, since lifting my feet too high risked disturbing the sand books. The sound of the sand in my left shoe was now a definite scrunch slosh, a rhythm that was starting to harmonize quite nicely with the Beatles' lullaby. The search for the history of silence was particularly fraught because, logically, a book about silence should be the heaviest book of all. Silence is not an absence. It is a weight, the accumulation of everything left unsaid, every word swallowed, every noise refused entry. It is a terrifying density of potential communication. Therefore, its sand should be the hardest to balance, the most prone to turning into glowing, humming evidence of my reading. I spent what I estimate was the equivalent of 23 hours, or perhaps 17 seconds. I saw a shadow pass the ceiling that looked suspiciously like a fleeting thought about toast. Navigating the newly installed aisle of mouth harps. The air here smelled metallic and slightly of old velvet. I paused, carefully transferring the architecture book from my right hand to a small, temporary plinth, a discarded concept for a perpetually folding chair, so I could scratch an itch behind my left ear. Immediately, 2 grains of sand from the transferred book turned into a pair of minuscule, incandescent emerald beetles that landed precisely on my knuckle. Pausing to survey the topography of my skin before diving into the safety of my pocket. 2 more, I muttered. That's probably a full paragraph on the ideal tensile strength of a hypothetical load-bearing cornice. I'll never find silence if I keep reading about construction. I retrieved the book, re-establishing the delicate dome of sand on my hand. I needed to move faster before the cats decided the gravity well needed retuning. Ahead, past a disturbing installation of books made entirely of dried citrus peel, the taxonomy of minor irritations, if memory served, I detected the faint, specific chill. It was the chill of non-sound. It tasted like ozone and deep, profound resignation. I was getting closer. I crept forward, focusing my gaze intently on the space between the citrus peels and an area that shimmered slightly, indicating a high concentration of highly forgotten secrets. I dared not blink. The stone cats were watching, their expressions unchanging but undeniably smug. I located the general area. It wasn't an aisle, it was a clearing. and in the center of the clearing, piled high on a low slate pedestal, was a colossal mound of sand. It was unlike any other book in the library. Most sand books were merely thin veneers, delicate dunes barely covering the back of my hand. This was a miniature mountain. This was the history of silence. It was absolutely static. There was no movement in the sand at all, despite the library's continuous gentle internal tremor. It absorbed the non-light. And, crucially, there was no hum. The beetles in my pocket, usually singing their little siren song, had gone dead quiet. Even the tiny emerald editions from the cornice paragraph were holding their breath. The silence emanating from the book was so thick it felt like wading through refrigerated syrup. I approached the pedestal slowly, rusty spoon held ready. This was the moment of climax. I had found the heaviest book, the repository of 80 years, or 3 minutes, of searching. Now I had to confirm its weight and classify it. It was clearly a Zeta-9, a secret so thoroughly forgotten that its density had become absolute zero, folding back in on itself to become the heaviest thing in the universe. I reached out my hand, the one not currently balancing 3 treatises on yawning, and stopped. I could not risk touching the book directly. If I read even 1 grain of sand from the history of silence, the resulting cascade of glowing, humming, materialized insects would be enough to drown the entire sleeping city in tiny, loud regret. It would be an audible catastrophe. I had to use the spoon. I extended the rusty spoon, aiming for the very apex of the sand mountain. The metal glinted faintly in the non-light. My heart, or whatever heavily calcified muscle handles the pumping of existential dread, thumped a sluggish rhythm. As the spoon neared the sand, the stone cats moved. They didn't move their feet or their bodies. They moved the air. The air around the pedestal suddenly warped, not in a visible ripple, but in a subtle, sickening lurch that made my knees feel like they had been temporarily replaced with room-temperature custard. I blinked. I couldn't help it. The pressure was too much. Blink. When my eyes opened, the magnificent, terrifying mountain of sand was gone. In its place was a single, tiny, exquisitely carved wooden duck. I stared at the duck. The pedestal was still there, the slate cold beneath the duck's miniature webbed feet. The surrounding air still felt like refrigerated syrup, but the dense, beautiful silence had lifted, replaced by the faint, distant hum of the beetles in my pockets resuming their lullaby. Volume 2, Verse 4. The stone cats had successfully swapped the history of silence with the world's most useless placeholder, a wooden duck, I stated flatly, addressing the largest cat. Seriously, is this Chapter 7, the ineffectiveness of symbolic retaliation, or are we aiming for the subsection on waterfowl and the displacement of abstract concepts? The cats offered no explanation. They just sat, radiating dense, judgmental silence, which was, I realized with a sudden, dull shock, exactly what I had been searching for. The history of silence wasn't the mountain of sand. It was the deliberate, frustrating, organized non-communication of the stone cats. They held the knowledge of silence, and they were classifying it precisely by denying me access. My mission wasn't to organize the book, it was to find the silence, and I had. The weight of the forgotten secret of silence was not in the sand, but in the sheer unmoving apathy of the stone cats. It was a secret so deep that it didn't even bother to become sand. The revelation was heavy. It was certainly Zeta-9 material. It pressed down on me. making my already sand-filled left shoe feel impossibly cumbersome. I looked at the wooden duck. It was carved with exceptional skill, possessing a small, satisfied smirk. "Fine," I told the cats, setting down the treatises on yawning and the architecture book, letting the resulting shower of glowing beetles pour into my pocket without care. They settled instantly, their collective hum rising to a cheerful, triumphant chorus. I picked up the wooden duck. I still had the rusty spoon. If the history of silence was the silence itself, manifested by the cats, then I needed to classify the concept of giving up. I used the spoon to scoop up the entire wooden duck. It was a perfect fit in the bowl of the spoon. It felt strangely warm. I held the duck up, balancing it on the rusty metal. It weighed exactly the weight of 80 years of trying to make sense of something that refused sense. It weighed the precise amount of 3 minutes of existential futility. I didn't need to weigh the forgetting. I just needed to accept the inevitable. I dropped the wooden duck and the spoon. They landed softly in the fine white sand of the library floor. I looked down at the copious amount of knowledge I had just freed from the responsibility of organization. The beetles were singing their highest note now, a perfect C-sharp of weary contentment. I knelt down in the sand, ignoring the sharp discomfort of my full shoe. I began gathering the fallen silica into a pile. I wasn't classifying, I wasn't organizing. I was simply moving the forgotten secrets into a new configuration. I started building a castle, a small, perfectly useless sand castle. I used the treatises on yawning as temporary walls. I used the discarded citrus peel books for structural reinforcement. I didn't care about the history of silence anymore. The stone cats could sit and judge my construction techniques. It didn't matter. As I smoothed the topmost turret, using my tired, sand-covered palm, the beetles in my pockets began to quiet down again. They weren't singing Volume 2 anymore. They had moved on to Volume 3, which was less of a lullaby and more of a soft, constant white noise, exactly the sound of a large room full of people finally exhaling in unison. The silence, the true, profound silence, returned. It wasn't hostile this time. It settled over the library like a warm, heavy blanket. The stone cats seemed to relax slightly, their stony postures softening into something approximating bored acceptance. The greatest secret, the densest weight of all, was simply the permission to stop organizing and start building something entirely meaningless. I rested my head back on the damp sand of the floor, letting the weight of the city settle around me. The sand in my left shoe was now perfectly settled, a comforting, familiar pressure. I closed my eyes. I didn't worry about the cats moving the castle when I blinked. I knew they wouldn't. This was the one organization system they couldn't argue with. I drifted toward a sleep within the sleep, listening to the soft, dusty hum of the knowledge I had finally given up trying to control. It sounded like 80 years of peaceful exhaustion, or maybe 3 beautiful minutes. It didn't really matter. I have no idea what this story is about. Volume 2. The stone cats had done it again. It was predictable, really, the way they waited for the necessary optical reset that blinking provided. They didn't even try to be subtle. 1 second, I was facing what I strongly suspected was the geographical north, defined only by the faint smell of wet moss and poorly rendered historical facts. And the next, I was facing a direction that could only be described as slightly damp, which meant they had rotated the entire conceptual grid around me, approximately 13 degrees counterclockwise. Or perhaps just swapped the positions of the three largest non-corporeal feelings I was attempting to organize yesterday. My eyelids scraped open, heavy with the fine dust of unread intention. And the world, the non-world really, this library that only exists in the brief communal pause between midnight and 2 minutes past, snapped back into place, now featuring a particularly jarring arrangement of sand piles that definitely weren't there a microsecond ago. I swayed slightly, the movement a consequence not of dizziness, but of the absolute necessity of keeping the sand books perfectly level on the back of both hands. This constant need for static equilibrium was utterly exhausting, particularly when compounded by the deep, existential fatigue that accompanies 80 years of organizing things that don't technically exist. Or, as I keep reminding myself, 3 minutes. The distinction is becoming increasingly irrelevant, like arguing over whether rain is falling or simply experiencing a profound failure of upward motivation. The sand on my left hand, which represented the completed section, the heavy secrets, the ones that felt like damp velvet and smelled vaguely of regret and forgotten birthdays, shifted, just barely. I stabilized it with a tired sigh, which immediately resulted in a cascade failure of 4 or 5 individual sand grains turning into minute, iridescent beetles that zipped immediately down my cuff and into the warm darkness of my pocket. They joined the chorus already established there, a low, persistent hum that vibrated against my hip bone, a sound like 1,000 tiny dynamos running on pure, condensed nostalgia. They were getting louder. This usually meant I was either nearing the end of my shift or that the ambient air pressure was about to change the fundamental molecular structure of sadness. I needed to find the history of silence. It was proving to be a stubbornly quiet volume, which was perhaps the point, but it was frustrating nonetheless. The organization system, weight of a forgotten secret, demanded that I find it, weigh it, and assign it its proper coordinate in the vast, unshelved space that stretched out until the edges of unconsciousness. I lifted the rusty spoon. It was the only tool I had for determining the weight of a secret, and while entirely inadequate for the task of measurement, it was perfectly suited for the task of pretending to measure. The rust, I had determined over the course of those 80 or 3 minutes, was the critical component. It was the only tangible decay in this entire ephemeral city. Therefore, it was the only reliable constant. When I tapped the sand with the spoon's bowl, the rust particles theoretically resonated with the density of the secret embedded within the sand grains. Or they didn't. Usually they didn't. But the act itself was the important part. Libraries, even nonsensical ones, demand ritual. I shuffled forward, a delicate, sand-laden ballet of utter exhaustion. The problem was the shoes. They were now substantially filled with sand, having crossed the threshold from slightly gritty to wearing 2 small, densely packed cement blocks. Every step was an argument with gravity that I was slowly losing. The internal monologue was getting louder. The humming from the beetles was competing with the internal monologue, and the stone cats were waiting. They were always waiting, sitting motionless on the periphery, looking exactly like the concept of patience mixed with malice. They were carved from the material that comprises unfulfilled potential, and they moved only when I couldn't confirm their position. Right, I muttered, mostly to keep the beetles from thinking I had fallen asleep standing up. Silence. Where does silence hide when everything is made of humming? I held up the left hand, the categorized sand. This was the section for secrets that involved accidental loss. A key, a promise, the ability to whistle. It was heavy. It needed a spoon tap to confirm its density before I moved on. I extended the spoon. The light, which was the color of weak tea and regret, caught the rough, pitted surface of the iron. I brought it down, slowly, agonizingly slowly, because if I moved too fast, the centrifugal force might destabilize the secret about the missing garden gnome. Tap. The sound was not metallic. It was the sound of distant whispering captured in porous material. I listened. It confirmed that the sand held the weight of secrets equivalent to 4.7 units of unnecessary hesitation. Standard. I nodded slowly. Now for the right hand. The right hand was the seeking hand, currently holding the collection of vaguely related, unfiled concepts that I needed to examine. Today, it was holding the theory of unused doorknobs, why the sky is not blue enough, and a brief history of the letter Q's self-doubt. These were lighter, less dense secrets, mostly categorized as 1.2 to 2.5 units of minor inconvenience. I blinked. Just a quick, desperate bat of the lids to clear the fine dust. When my eyes opened, everything had shifted. The stone cats were staring, their polished, emotionless eyes confirming their successful sabotage. Where the aisle containing doorknobs had been, there was now a large, unsettling pile of sand that seemed to absorb the weak tea light. It had a different texture. It wasn't sparkling white. It was a pale, dusty gray, the color of old cement left out in the rain, or perhaps the color of a voice that has been unused for a very, very long time. My breath hitched, not because of excitement, but because it took significant muscular effort to avoid dropping the sand when startled. "Oh, hello," I said, addressing the new sand pile, which rested precisely where the cats had moved it. "You look heavy." I carefully transferred the sand from doorknobs and sky to the back of my forearm, a precarious temporary shelving unit, and eased the large gray mass onto the back of my right hand. It settled immediately, dense and inert. It felt heavier than the 4 units of regret I already carried on the left. It was a substantial geological weight, suggesting a secret that had fossilized from sheer neglect. This had to be it. The history of silence. The challenge was that silence, by its nature, resists measurement. How do you weigh an absence? I suspected the secret contained within this sand wasn't about silence, but was the silence itself, somehow condensed and contained. I lifted the rusty spoon again. The beetles in my pocket increased their collective volume, moving from a gentle hum to a noticeable, though still soothing, drone. They were anticipating the measurement, sensing the potential shift in organizational hierarchy. I held the spoon directly over the gray sand. I didn't dare tap it yet. I had to determine the appropriate method for weighing the absence of information. The usual method, the rust particle resonance, wouldn't work if the subject was resistant to sound vibration. This required a different kind of tool assessment. I started examining the spoon. It was so rusty, it was mostly air and irony. I ran my thumb over the bowl, feeling the delicate ridges of oxidation. The true weight of a forgotten secret, I realized, must be measured not by how the secret reacts to the spoon, but how the spoon reacts to the concept of the secret. I held the spoon horizontally, parallel to the sand. "What is the spoon thinking?" I whispered. The spoon thought nothing. It was an inanimate object. But in this library, inanimate objects often carried a profound, unstated opinion on the nature of organizational efficiency. The apathy was strong. The spoon, by simply being old and rusted and useless, seemed to suggest that the history of silence weighed exactly as much as the history of noise, which was to say, nothing at all, but measured across the immense span of time it takes to lose interest. I needed a number. The grid demanded precision, even if the precision was entirely arbitrary. I decided to use the visual methodology. I lowered the spoon until it cast a faint, jagged shadow across the gray sand. The shadow was crisp, defined. Unlike the white sand, which tended to soften shadows and diffuse light, the gray sand absorbed it completely. Ah, I sighed, the exhaustion leaching into my voice. The weight of a forgotten secret is defined by its resistance to illumination. I spent the next 45 minutes, or perhaps the next 9 seconds, staring intensely at the shadow. I needed to quantify the shadow's resistance. I assigned the brightest sand, a pile representing the secret of why we wear socks, a resistance rating of 1.0. The regret sand on my left hand measured at 4.7, due to the density of the dampness inherent in regret. This gray sand, this history of profound quiet, was different. It didn't just resist light. It seemed to pull it in, preventing scattering. The shadow was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical manifestation of focused obscurity. I settled on a high number. It felt right. Absence, when forgotten, becomes terribly heavy. The weight of the forgotten history of silence, I declared, my voice flat and monotone, is 19.3 units of organized obscurity. I moved the spoon away. The number felt sufficiently precise and meaningless. I had done the work. The book was measured. The stone cats remained motionless, clearly unimpressed by the numerical assignment. Now came the final, most strenuous part of the resolution: filing the book. Filing did not involve shelving, as there were no shelves. It involved assigning the coordinate and holding the sand in that location in space until the city blinked out of existence. Since 19.3 units was the highest weight I had measured yet, the sand needed to be placed far, far away, in the conceptual outer limits of the library, near the area designated for secrets that will never be told, even accidentally. This area existed somewhere between the concept of too cold and the color indigo. I had to move. With shoes full of heavy grit and hands balancing a secret that weighed nearly 20 units of forgotten quiet, I had to walk. I began shuffling toward the imaginary perimeter. Each step was an ordeal. I could feel the sand in my shoes compressing, turning into a solid, unyielding ballast. My feet felt like roots growing into an imaginary foundation. The beetles noticed the change in trajectory. They shifted their hum, escalating from a soothing drone to a high-pitched, insistent whirring, like tiny clock mechanisms running too fast. They were trying to tell me something, probably that the weight on my hands was unsustainable, but I had learned long ago to interpret the beetle chorus as encouragement, or at least as a necessary background noise to prevent the silence from becoming absolute. I walked for what felt like 200 miles, though in reality, I suspect I managed perhaps 7 or 8 inches of lateral movement. The gray sand started to feel cold, leaching the heat from my palms. As I neared the indigo zone, where the shadows started to develop edges that weren't quite straight, the sand on my left hand, the measured regret, began to react. The high weight of silence was somehow polarizing the existing, smaller secrets. I watched, numbly, as the 4.7 units of regret began to tremble. A sentence, one that I had accidentally read aloud weeks ago about a lost fountain pen, started to reorganize itself. A single, perfect grain of white sand detached itself from the pile, turned into a shimmering, slightly distressed beetle, and flew across the gap, attempting to land on the gray sand of silence. This was catastrophic. Cross-contamination of secrets was highly discouraged. I tried to stabilize the left hand, but the beetle had already performed its chaotic insertion. As soon as it landed on the gray sand, it vanished. It didn't turn back into sand. It didn't crawl into my pocket. It simply became part of the 19.3 units of obscurity. Oh, marvelous, I sighed. Now the history of silence contains the regret over a fountain pen. That seems overly dramatic. But the reaction had started. The integration of the small regret into the massive silence had destabilized the entire structure. The library was starting to flicker at the edges, the weak tea light pulsating unevenly. The stone cats were stretching, their joints grinding like slow, indifferent gears. This meant the shift was ending. The city was preparing to dissolve. I had to place the sand now. The weight was becoming too much. It felt less like sand and more like condensed time. I stopped in the indigo light. I pushed my hands forward, slowly and deliberately, easing the weight of the sand books into the coordinates I had calculated. X-axis, 19.3. Y-axis, high indifference. Z-axis, just past too cold. The moment the sand left my palms, the weight vanished. It didn't fall. It simply hung there, a dense cloud of gray material, perfectly suspended, pulsing faintly with the trapped memory of the fountain pen. The mission was complete. The history of silence was filed. I stood there, my hands suddenly light, almost painfully empty. The absence of the sand was now heavier than the sand itself had been. The beetles, sensing their purpose fulfilled, cranked their humming up to an unbearable, sleep-inducing shriek. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny, pocket-sized entities demanding immediate rest. My shoes, however, were still full of sand. That weight remained. The pragmatic, personal exhaustion that wasn't tied to the organization system stayed put. I leaned back, my spine protesting the 80 years of continuous low-level muscular tension. The indigo light intensified, then dissolved into pure blackness. The floor beneath my heavy, sand-filled shoes started to disappear, not with a crash, but with a gentle, apathetic fading, like a poorly maintained photograph. I closed my eyes. There was no longer any need to keep them open, as there was nothing left to see, and, crucially, nothing left for the stone cats to move. I didn't even care if they moved something now. I wouldn't notice. The beetles in my pockets were now singing a distinct, repetitive lullaby, vibrating the fabric of my trousers with soothing intensity. The sand in my shoes felt warm, like the memory of a distant beach vacation I never actually took. I slipped lower, collapsing onto the fading floor, the sound of the world draining away, leaving only the tiny, insistent drone of the filing system in my pocket. 80 years, 3 minutes. It didn't matter. The silence, now organized, was vast and comforting. I was asleep before my head conceptually touched the ground, floating safely on the organizational weight of forgotten things.